My name is Sarah Mitchell, and for the past 5 years, I've been the family disappointment. While my sister Jessica climbed her way up the corporate ladder in Portland, collecting designer handbags in a corner office view, I've been stuck in our childhood bedroom in Riverside, Oregon, working at the community center for what everyone assumes is barely above minimum wage. At every family gathering, Jessica made sure everyone knew exactly how she felt about my life choices. But what she didn't know was that the sister she called pathetic for living at home had been quietly building an empire right under her nose. And the house she thought I was too weak to leave? Well, let's just say the deed tells a very different story. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I should have known Jessica would turn Uncle Tom's annual barbecue into another opportunity to showcase my failures. She arrived in her spotless BMW, stepping out in white designer jeans that probably cost more than I made in a month at the community center, or at least that's what she believed. Her husband Brian followed behind her, adjusting his polo shirt and checking his phone with the distracted air of someone who considered family gatherings beneath his pay grade. The afternoon had been going relatively smoothly until cousin Mike brought up housing prices in Portland. That's when Jessica's eyes lit up with that familiar predatory gleam that meant she'd found her opening. She set down her wine glass and turned toward where I was helping Dad flip burgers, her voice carrying that perfectly modulated tone she'd perfected during her MBA program. "You know what's funny?" she announced to the group gathered around the patio table. "Everyone's talking about how impossible it is to afford a house these days, and here's Sarah, 28 years old, still living in Mom and Dad's spare bedroom." The conversation died. Aunt Karen looked down at her potato salad. Uncle Tom suddenly became very interested in adjusting the umbrella angle. But Jessica wasn't finished. She stood up, wine glass in hand, addressing the family like she was giving a presentation to her board of directors. I mean, at what point do you stop making excuses and actually try to build a life? Brian and I bought our condo when I was 25. We didn't wait around for life to happen to us. I continued flipping burgers, letting the sizzle of the meat fill the uncomfortable silence. Dad's jaw was tight, but he kept quiet. That was Dad's way, never one to make waves, even when his daughter was being humiliated in his own brother's backyard. "Sarah works hard," Mom said quietly, but her voice lacked conviction. Even she didn't fully understand what I did all day at the community center, and I'd never bothered to explain the full scope of my responsibilities there. Jessica laughed, not the warm laugh I remembered from our childhood, but the cold, professional chuckle she'd developed somewhere between her corporate climbing and her marriage to a man who measured success in stock portfolios. "Oh, I'm sure she does. Planning craft activities and organizing bingo nights is certainly challenging work." The condescension in her voice made my stomach clench, but I kept my expression neutral. Brian nodded along, though I suspected he had no idea what Jessica's point was. He was the kind of man who agreed with his wife in public and checked sports scores on his phone when she wasn't looking. "The thing is," Jessica continued, warming to her theme, "there comes a time when you have to stop being pathetic and actually take responsibility for your life. Living with your parents at almost 30 isn't charming or helpful. It's embarrassing." That word hung in the air like smoke from the grill. Pathetic. She'd used it before, usually in private phone calls with Mom, when she thought I wasn't listening, but never this directly, never in front of the whole family. I set down the spatula and finally turned to face her. "You're absolutely right, Jess," I said calmly, meeting her eyes. "Living with your parents at almost 30 would be pathetic." She smiled triumphantly, thinking she'd finally gotten through to me. "Exactly. So when are you going to do something about it?" I smiled back, but there was something in my expression that made Uncle Tom lean forward slightly, like he sensed the shift in the air. "Well, that depends. When are you going to stop assuming you know anything about my life?" The confidence in Jessica's smile wavered just slightly. Brian looked up from his phone, finally sensing that something interesting might be happening. Dad stopped pretending to organize the condiment table and turned his full attention to us. "What's that supposed to mean?" Jessica asked, her voice still controlled but with an edge creeping in. I picked up my water bottle and took a slow sip, letting the moment stretch. The truth was sitting right there, ready to be revealed, but I'd learned patience over the past 5 years. I'd learned the value of timing, of letting people show you exactly who they are before you show them who you've become. It means maybe you should ask more questions before you make assumptions, I said simply. But don't worry about it now. Enjoy your wine. Enjoy telling everyone how successful you are. We'll have plenty of time to talk about real estate later. Something in those last 3 words made Jessica's expression shift. For just a moment, the polished confidence cracked, and I saw uncertainty flicker across her face. But she recovered quickly, laughing and shaking her head like I'd just said something adorable and naive. Real estate? Sarah, you can't even afford to move out of your childhood bedroom. What could you possibly know about real estate? I turned back to the grill, letting the question hang unanswered. Around us, the family had gone quiet again, but this time it felt different. Less uncomfortable, more expectant. Even cousin Mike had stopped scrolling through his phone and was watching us with interest. The thing about secrets is that they have weight. For 5 years, I'd been carrying the weight of what I really did during my days, what I'd been building, while Jessica collected corporate achievements like trophies. And that weight was about to shift in a way that would change everything she thought she knew about success, about family, and about the sister she'd spent half a decade calling pathetic. But that revelation would have to wait. For now, I was content to let her enjoy her moment of superiority, because I knew something she didn't. In 3 days, the Riverside City Council would announce the approval of the Historic District Development Project. In 3 days, the property values in our neighborhood would triple overnight. And in 3 days, Jessica would discover that her pathetic little sister owned not just the family home, but 6 other properties in the historic district that would soon be worth more than her precious Portland condo and Brian's entire investment portfolio combined. For now, though, I flipped burgers and let her talk. After all, I'd learned that the best revelations come to those who wait for the perfect moment to deliver them. Growing up, Jessica and I hadn't always been enemies. In fact, we'd been inseparable through most of our childhood here in Riverside. We'd shared a room until she turned 13 and demanded her own space, spent summers building forts in the big oak tree behind our Victorian house, and dreamed together about all the places we'd go and things we'd accomplish when we grew up. The split happened gradually, then, all at once. When Jessica graduated high school as valedictorian, she had acceptance letters from 3 universities. She chose University of Oregon because it was far enough from Riverside to feel like freedom, but close enough that she could still come home for holidays with stories of her sophisticated college life. I, on the other hand, chose Riverside Community College, not because I couldn't get into a 4-year university, though that's what Jessica began telling people, but because I'd already seen something she hadn't. While she was dreaming of escaping our small town, I was watching it prepare for transformation. Dad had owned Mitchell Hardware on Main Street for 30 years. It was the kind of store where you could buy a single screw, get advice on fixing a leaky faucet, and catch up on local gossip all in one trip. But by the time Jessica left for college, the writing was on the wall. Big box stores had already claimed most of Dad's business, and the town was starting to change in ways that excited me rather than worried me. Developers had been quietly sniffing around Riverside for years, drawn by its location between Portland and the coast, its intact historic architecture, and its affordable property prices. While Jessica was learning about corporate strategy and market analysis in her business classes, I was learning about those same things in real time, watching how development patterns worked, studying which neighborhoods got targeted first, and understanding the timeline of gentrification. The summer after my freshman year at community college, while Jessica was interning at a Portland marketing firm and posting Instagram photos of herself in professional attire, I was working part-time at Dad's hardware store and part-time for Mrs. Chen at the community center. Mrs. Chen was David's aunt, and David was the quiet, serious young man who'd been helping her with the center's bookkeeping and grant applications. David had graduated from Portland State with a degree in urban planning, but instead of chasing jobs in big cities, he'd come back to Riverside to help his aunt and to be close to his aging grandparents. Jessica would have called that lack of ambition. I called it strategic positioning. It was David who first explained to me how historic preservation grants worked, how tax incentives could make property development incredibly profitable, and how small towns like Riverside were perfect candidates for what urban planners called heritage-based revitalization. While Jessica was learning theory in classrooms David and I were identifying which properties in Riverside would be most valuable when the inevitable development boom arrived. My job at the community center was perfect cover. As the program coordinator, I had legitimate reasons to walk through every neighborhood in Riverside, to knock on doors and talk to longtime residents, to understand which families were struggling financially and might be willing to sell their properties. I wasn't taking advantage of anyone. I was offering fair market prices for properties that most owners saw as burdens rather than assets. The first property I bought was Mrs. Patterson's cottage on Elm Street. She was 83, living on Social Security, and couldn't afford the roof repairs her house desperately needed. She'd been talking about moving to assisted living, but couldn't sell her house because of its condition. I offered her $15,000 above what she'd been asking, paid for the roof repairs myself, and had the deed transferred through a limited liability company I'd set up with David's help. To everyone else, including my family, it looked like Mrs. Patterson had finally found a buyer for her rundown cottage. No one knew that buyer was me, working through an LLC called Riverside Heritage Properties. And no one questioned why the community center's program coordinator spent so much time in the historic district. Because organizing neighborhood events and senior outreach programs gave me perfect cover for my real work. By the time Jessica graduated from college with her business degree, I owned 3 properties in Riverside's most historic neighborhoods. When she got married to Brian 2 years later in an expensive Portland ceremony, I owned 5. And when she started making comments about my failure to launch and my pathetic living situation, I was closing on my 7th property acquisition while living rent-free in the family home and saving every penny of my community center salary for down payments and property improvements. The beauty of my situation was that everyone saw exactly what they expected to see. To my family, I was the daughter who'd stayed home, taken the safe path, and never quite figured out how to build an adult life. To the community, I was the helpful young woman who organized senior lunches and coordinated after-school programs. To property sellers, I was the representative of a small development company interested in preserving Riverside's historic character. Only David knew the full scope of what I was building, and David understood the long game in ways that Jessica's quarterly profit reports couldn't capture. We'd spent countless evenings in his apartment above his grandmother's garage, spreading maps across his kitchen table and analyzing development patterns in similar towns throughout Oregon and Washington. We'd calculated timeline projections, studied zoning laws, and identified the exact trigger points that would transform Riverside from a sleepy town into a destination community. The trigger point we'd been waiting for was the historic district designation and the accompanying infrastructure development project. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. For 3 years, the City Council had been debating whether to apply for state and federal grants that would restore Main Street's historic facades, improve the waterfront park, and create the kind of pedestrian-friendly downtown that attracted tourists and new residents. Jessica knew none of this. During her brief visits home, she saw what she'd always seen: a boring, small town that she'd been smart to escape, a sister who lacked the ambition to leave, and parents who were content with their simple life. She never asked about my work beyond the surface level, never wondered why I seemed so content with my supposedly dead-end job, and never questioned why I wasn't desperately trying to escape Riverside the way she had. Her condescension had started small, little comments about how I should consider moving to Portland, suggestions that she could help me find a real job, observations about how I was wasting my potential. But as her own success grew, as Brian's investment portfolio expanded, as their Portland social circle became more exclusive, her comments became sharper, more pointed, more designed to highlight the gap between her achievements and my apparent stagnation. The irony was that while Jessica was building a life that looked successful from the outside, I was building something that would be successful from any angle. Her Portland condo was worth $400,000, and she was proud of that. But she had no idea that her pathetic little sister owned properties that would soon be worth more than her condo, her husband's car, and his annual bonus combined. She also had no idea that the sister she'd been dismissing as a failure had spent 5 years learning everything there was to know about real estate development, property management, historic preservation, and municipal planning. While she'd been networking at corporate happy hours, I'd been attending city council meetings. While she'd been earning her MBA, I'd been earning the respect of local officials, contractors, and longtime residents who would be crucial partners when Riverside's transformation began. But perhaps most importantly, Jessica had no idea that her pathetic little sister had been watching, learning, and remembering every condescending comment, every dismissive laugh, every moment when she'd made it clear that she considered herself superior in every way that mattered. The thing about building something quietly is that people don't see it until it's too big to ignore. And Jessica was about to discover that some foundations, once laid carefully and patiently, can support structures that reach much higher than anyone imagined possible. 3 days passed after Uncle Tom's barbecue, and the tension in our house was thick enough to cut with a knife. Jessica had extended her visit, claiming she wanted to spend more time with Mom and Dad, but I knew better. Something about our conversation at the barbecue had unsettled her, and Jessica never left anything unsettled. She was the type of person who needed to understand every angle, control every narrative, and right now she sensed there was something she was missing. She'd been watching me differently since Sunday, following me with her eyes when she thought I wasn't looking, asking seemingly casual questions about my work schedule and my plans. When I left for the community center each morning, I could feel her gaze burning into my back from the living room window. When I came home in the evenings, she'd suddenly appear in the kitchen, ready with comments about how tired I looked, or suggestions about job opportunities in Portland. Wednesday morning arrived gray and drizzly, typical October weather for Oregon. I was sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop and a cup of coffee when Jessica wandered downstairs in her silk pajamas, the kind that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. She poured herself coffee from the pot Dad had made earlier and settled into the chair across from me with studied casualness. "Working from home today?" she asked, nodding toward my laptop screen. I'd quickly minimized the window showing property tax assessments for the historic district, but not before she'd gotten a glimpse of official-looking documents with dollar amounts that didn't match what she thought I earned. "Just catching up on some paperwork," I said, closing the laptop entirely. "Community center administration stuff." She sipped her coffee, watching me over the rim of her mug. "You know, I've been thinking about what you said on Sunday. About real estate." "Oh yeah? Yeah. I mean, I know you were probably just trying to deflect from the conversation about your living situation, but it got me curious. What exactly do you do at the community center that involves real estate?" There it was. Jessica's interrogation technique hadn't changed since we were kids. She'd start with an assumption designed to put you on the defensive, then ask pointed questions that forced you to either lie or reveal more than you intended. It had worked on me when I was 12, and she'd wanted to know if I'd been the one who broke Mom's favorite vase. It wasn't going to work on me now. "We do neighborhood outreach," I said truthfully. "Property assessments for program eligibility, connecting seniors with resources for home maintenance, that kind of thing." "Property assessments?" She repeated the words slowly, like she was testing their flavor. "That sounds more involved than craft activities and bingo nights." "There's a lot more to community work than people realize," I said, standing up and putting my mug in the dishwasher. "But I wouldn't expect you to understand that. Your world runs on quarterly reports and profit margins. Mine runs on actually helping people." It was a low blow, and we both knew it. Jessica's face flushed slightly, but she kept her voice level. "I help people too, Sarah. I help them grow their investments and secure their financial futures. Right. By convincing them to trust their money to people like Brian. What's that supposed to mean?" I paused at the kitchen doorway, laptop tucked under my arm. For a moment, I considered telling her exactly what it meant. I considered explaining that I'd done my research on Brian's investment firm, that I knew about their recent SEC warnings and their questionable practices with elderly clients' retirement funds. I considered mentioning that David had connections in Portland's financial sector who told us things about Meridian Wealth Management that would make Jessica's blood run cold. But that wasn't the revelation I'd been building toward. That was just a side note, an added irony that would make the main event even sweeter. "It means exactly what you think it means, Jess. But don't worry about it. You'll figure it out eventually." I left her sitting in the kitchen, staring after me with that expression I remembered from childhood when she couldn't solve a puzzle that seemed too easy for her to be missing something important. The community center was bustling when I arrived 20 minutes later. Wednesday was senior lunch day, which meant Mrs. Rodriguez was already in the kitchen preparing her famous tamales, while Mr. Patterson set up tables in the main hall. The energy was different today, though. There was an undercurrent of excitement that I'd been noticing for weeks, as rumors about the historic district designation spread through Riverside senior community. "Sarah, honey, is it true what I heard about Main Street?" Mrs. Rodriguez called out as I hung up my jacket. "My neighbor said the city's going to fix up all those old storefronts." "There's definitely been talk about it at the city council meetings," I said carefully. "Nothing's official yet." That was technically true. The vote wouldn't happen until this afternoon, and the public announcement wouldn't come until tomorrow. But I'd been attending those council meetings for 3 years, and I knew the political landscape well enough to read the signs. Councilmember Patricia Hayes had been the holdout, worried about the costs and the disruption to local businesses. But last month's feasibility study had addressed her concerns, and yesterday's closed session had been scheduled specifically to finalize the details. "Well, I hope they do something," Mr. Patterson said, arranging chairs around the tables. "Main Street's been looking shabby for too long. Might bring some life back to this town." Mr. Patterson had no idea how much life was about to return to Riverside, or how dramatically his own property values were about to increase. His house on Maple Street was just 3 doors down from my parents' place, and the lot size alone would make it incredibly attractive to developers once the historic district designation brought renewed interest to the neighborhood. David arrived at 10:30, carrying his laptop bag and wearing the kind of focused expression that meant he'd been up late running numbers. We'd established a routine over the past year where he'd come in on Wednesdays to help with grant applications and program planning, which gave us legitimate cover for spending hours analyzing development projections and property acquisition strategies. "Morning," he said, settling into the chair beside my desk. "Sleep well?" "Jessica's been asking questions," I said quietly, mindful of the seniors milling around the main room. "She saw something on my laptop this morning." "Property assessments." David's eyebrows went up slightly. "How much did she see?" "Not enough to understand what she was looking at, but enough to know it doesn't match her assumptions about my job." I pulled up the city council agenda on my computer screen. Speaking of which, they moved the vote up to 2 o'clock. Nervous? Excited. And I was. After 3 years of careful planning, strategic property acquisitions, and patient waiting, everything was about to pay off in ways that would shock everyone who thought they knew Sarah Mitchell. We spent the morning reviewing the final details of our expansion strategy. Once the historic district designation was announced, property values would start climbing immediately, but the real boom would come when construction began on the infrastructure improvements. That was when we'd start selectively selling some of our properties to developers, while keeping the prime locations for long-term rental income. The beauty of our approach was that we'd positioned ourselves to benefit from every phase of Riverside's transformation. We owned properties that would immediately increase in value due to historic designation. We owned corner lots that would become premium retail locations once Main Street was renovated. And we owned residential properties in the historic district that would become highly desirable once the area transformed into Riverside's premier neighborhood. At 1:30, I told Mrs. Rodriguez I had a dentist appointment and would be back later to help with afternoon cleanup. David and I walked the 6 blocks to City Hall through the light rain, joining the small crowd of residents who'd shown up for the council meeting. Most of them were longtime Riverside residents who'd heard rumors about the historic district proposal and wanted to understand what it meant for their community. Patricia Hayes called the meeting to order at exactly 2 o'clock, and the vote on Resolution 2023-847 was the third item on the agenda. The discussion was brief but thorough, covering the financial implications, the timeline for implementation, and the expected impact on local businesses and residents. When Hayes called for the vote, it was unanimous. 5 votes in favor of applying for historic district designation and pursuing the accompanying development grants. The announcement itself was dry and bureaucratic, but I felt my heart racing as Hayes read the resolution into the record. In that moment, 3 years of planning crystallized into official policy. Riverside's historic district would receive state and federal funding for facade restoration, street improvements, and infrastructure upgrades. Property values in the designated area would immediately qualify for tax incentives and development credits that would make investment incredibly attractive. As the meeting adjourned and residents began filing out, most of them looked pleased but not particularly excited. They saw the resolution as a nice improvement to their community, not as the economic earthquake it actually represented. Only David and I understood the full magnitude of what had just happened. "How does it feel to be a real estate mogul?" he whispered as we walked back toward the community center. "Ask me tomorrow when Jessica finds out," I said, but I was smiling. We were halfway back when my phone buzzed with a text from Mom. "Jessica wants to take everyone out to dinner tonight to celebrate her promotion. Eddie's Steakhouse at 7. Can you make it?" I showed the message to David, and he shook his head with amusement. "Perfect timing." "What do you mean?" "Think about it. Tomorrow morning, the historic district announcement will be in the newspaper. Property assessments will start getting updated within a week. Real estate agents will start calling property owners in the historic district to discuss selling opportunities. And tonight, Jessica wants to celebrate her success while lecturing you about your lack of ambition." He was right. The irony was almost too perfect. Tonight would be Jessica's last chance to feel superior about her corporate achievements, because tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, the sister she'd been calling pathetic would quietly become one of the most successful real estate investors in Central Oregon. But more than that, tonight would be my last chance to watch Jessica perform her superiority without her knowing that the audience had changed. For months, I'd been the family disappointment, the sister who couldn't get her life together, the woman whose best prospect was organizing craft activities for senior citizens. After tomorrow, I'd be the sister who'd outsmarted everyone, who'd built wealth while pretending to be broke, who'd seen opportunity where others saw only a sleepy small town. The anticipation was intoxicating, not because I wanted to humiliate Jessica, but because I was finally ready to step out of the shadows I'd been working in for so long. I was ready to show my family who I really was and what I'd actually been building during all those years they thought I was wasting my potential. "Are you going to tell them tonight?" David asked. "Not everything," I said, already planning how the evening would unfold. "But maybe it's time for Jessica to understand that making assumptions about people can be dangerous." Eddie's Steakhouse was Riverside's idea of fine dining, which meant white tablecloths, dim lighting, and entrees that cost more than most locals spent on dinner for a week. Jessica had chosen it specifically because she knew it would emphasize the difference between her success and my supposed poverty. She probably expected me to order the cheapest item on the menu and let her pick up the check as another demonstration of her generosity toward her struggling sister. She had no idea that I could afford to buy Eddie's Steakhouse outright if I wanted to, or that I'd actually considered it as an investment property before deciding the location wasn't strategic enough for my portfolio. By the time David and I got back to the community center, word about the city council vote was already spreading through Riverside's informal communication network. Mrs. Rodriguez was practically bouncing with excitement as she told everyone who'd listen about the historic district designation and what it might mean for property values. Mr. Patterson was calculating how much his house might be worth if the improvements actually happened. I smiled and nodded and acted appropriately pleased, but inside I was already thinking about tomorrow's newspaper announcement and how dramatically it would change the conversation at our family dinner table. Tonight, Jessica would celebrate her promotion and probably make more comments about my need to develop professional ambition. Tomorrow, she'd wake up to discover that her pathetic little sister had just become significantly wealthier than she was. The only question now was how long I'd let her keep talking before I showed her exactly what real ambition looked like. By 6:45, I was dressed in my best outfit, which, by Jessica's standards, was probably still pathetic but would have to do. I'd chosen dark jeans and a sweater that Mom had given me for Christmas. Nothing that screamed success, but nothing that looked desperate either. The goal wasn't to compete with Jessica's designer wardrobe, but to let her overconfidence build to maximum height before reality brought her back down to earth. Dad had already left to pick up Mom, and Jessica was waiting in the living room when I came downstairs. She'd changed into a black dress that probably cost more than my monthly salary at the community center, paired with heels that added 4 inches to her height and jewelry that caught the light every time she moved. She looked like she was dressed for a business dinner in downtown Portland, not a family celebration at Riverside's local steakhouse. "You look nice," she said, and I could hear the barely concealed condescension in her voice. It was the tone you'd use to compliment a child who'd tried their best with limited resources. "Thanks. You look ready to close a major deal." "Actually, I kind of am." Her smile was sharp and satisfied. "The promotion comes with a new client portfolio worth about $12 million in assets. Brian thinks it could lead to a partnership track within 2 years." "Congratulations," I said. And I meant it. Jessica had worked hard for her success, even if she'd become insufferable about it. That's a big responsibility. It is. But that's what happens when you're willing to take risks and push yourself beyond your comfort zone. She picked up her purse, a leather creation that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. "Speaking of which, I've been thinking about our conversation on Sunday." "Which part?" "The part where you got defensive about your living situation. I think I came on too strong, and I want to apologize for that." This was new. Jessica apologizing for anything was rare enough to make me suspicious. "Okay. I realize that not everyone has the same opportunities I've had, and it's not fair for me to judge your choices without understanding your circumstances better." There it was. The apology that wasn't really an apology. The kind of statement that sounded generous but actually reinforced every assumption she'd been making about my life. She wasn't sorry for being condescending. She was sorry for being condescending to someone she saw as disadvantaged. "That's very understanding of you," I said carefully. "I've actually been thinking that maybe I could help. Brian has connections throughout the Pacific Northwest, and I'm sure we could find you something in Portland. Maybe not at my level right away, but something with growth potential. A real career track instead of..." She gestured vaguely toward the direction of the community center. "Instead of what I'm doing now." "Well, yes, I mean, working with seniors is admirable, but you're smart, Sarah. You could be doing so much more with your life. You could be building something that matters." The irony was so thick I could taste it. Here was Jessica, offering to help me build something that mattered, completely unaware that I'd spent the last 3 years building something that would dwarf her $12 million client portfolio. Here was Jessica, worried about my lack of career growth, not knowing that my net worth had increased more in the past 3 years than hers had in her entire professional life. "I appreciate the offer," I said, grabbing my jacket from the coat closet. "But I'm pretty happy with what I'm building here in Riverside." "Sarah." Her voice had that patient, older sister tone that used to make me feel small when we were kids. "Riverside isn't going anywhere. There's no growth here. No opportunities for someone with your potential. You're wasting your 20s in a town that peaked 30 years ago." I turned to face her, jacket in hand, and smiled. "You know what, Jess? You're absolutely right. Riverside isn't going anywhere." She looked pleased, thinking she'd finally gotten through to me. "It's going up," I added quietly. "What?" "Property values, development opportunities, economic growth. Riverside isn't going anywhere because it doesn't need to. Everything's coming here." Jessica frowned, clearly not understanding what I meant. "Sarah, that's not how economic development works. Small towns like this don't just suddenly become growth centers." "You're right," I said, opening the front door. "They don't just suddenly become growth centers. It takes planning, investment, and people who understand how to position themselves for long-term success instead of chasing quarterly profits." She followed me out to the porch, her heels clicking against the wooden boards. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the difference between looking successful and actually building wealth, between impressive job titles and strategic thinking, between playing the game everyone else is playing and creating your own game entirely." "Sarah, you're not making sense." I paused at the bottom of the porch steps, looking back at her silhouetted in the doorway light. Tomorrow, everything would be different. Tomorrow, she'd understand exactly what I'd been talking about. But tonight, she could enjoy her moment of superiority one last time. "Don't worry about it," I said. "You'll figure it out soon enough." As we drove to Eddie's in her pristine BMW, Jessica kept glancing at me with confused concern, like she was trying to solve a puzzle that had suddenly become more complicated than she'd expected. She'd spent 5 years thinking she understood her little sister perfectly, confident in her role as the successful one, the ambitious one, the sister who'd figured out how to build a meaningful life. She had no idea that the sister sitting beside her had been building something far more substantial than a corporate career, or that tomorrow's newspaper would shatter every assumption she'd made about success, ambition, and who in the Mitchell family had really figured out how to create lasting wealth. But she was about to find out. Eddie's Steakhouse was exactly what I'd expected. The kind of place that took itself seriously enough to have cloth napkins and a wine list, but not seriously enough to actually train the staff properly. Jessica had requested what she called the best table in the house, which turned out to be a corner booth with burgundy leather seats and a view of the parking lot. She'd arrived 15 minutes early to ensure everything was perfect for what she clearly saw as her triumphant evening. Mom and Dad were already seated when Jessica and I walked in, Dad looking uncomfortable in the sport coat Mom had insisted he wear, Mom beaming with pride at Jessica's success. Brian was checking his phone with the distracted air of someone who considered family dinners an obligation rather than a pleasure, but he stood when we approached and shook my hand with the kind of firm grip that was supposed to communicate confidence and dominance. "Sarah," he said with his practiced smile, "good to see you again. How's the community work going?" "Can't complain," I said, sliding into the booth across from him. "How's the investment business?" Something flickered across his expression, too quick for anyone else to notice, but I caught it. David's contacts in Portland had been very thorough in their research about Meridian Wealth Management, and what they'd found would make for interesting dinner conversation if I decided to share it. But tonight wasn't about Brian's questionable business practices. Tonight was about Jessica's assumptions. "Booming," he said, recovering his composure. "The market's been very good to us this year." "I bet it has," I said, accepting a menu from the server. The irony wasn't lost on me that Brian was bragging about market performance on the same day I'd become significantly wealthier than he was, thanks to a real estate portfolio he didn't even know existed. Jessica settled into the booth beside Brian with the satisfied air of someone who was about to hold court. She'd been building up to this dinner all week, I realized. The promotion was just the excuse. What she really wanted was another opportunity to showcase the gap between her success and my supposed failure, but this time with witnesses, and in a setting that emphasized her ability to afford nice things. "So," she said, opening her menu with theatrical flourish, "I thought tonight would be perfect for sharing some exciting news and maybe doing some family planning." Dad perked up at the mention of planning. He'd always been a planner, someone who liked to think 3 moves ahead, which made it even more ironic that he'd completely missed what his younger daughter had been planning for the past 3 years. "The promotion's official," Jessica continued, "and it comes with a significant salary increase. Brian and I have been talking about our 5-year goals, and we think it's time to start thinking about expanding the family." Mom practically glowed at this announcement. She'd been not so subtly hinting about grandchildren for the past 2 years, and Jessica's news was clearly the answer to her prayers. "That's wonderful, honey," Mom said, reaching across the table to squeeze Jessica's hand. "Have you thought about timing?" "Well, that's part of what we wanted to discuss tonight." Jessica's smile had that sharp edge I recognized from childhood, the one that meant she was about to make a point at someone else's expense. "We've been looking at houses in Lake Oswego, and we found this beautiful colonial that would be perfect for raising children." Lake Oswego was Portland's most exclusive suburb, where houses started at 7 figures and neighbors competed over who had the most perfectly manicured lawn. It was exactly the kind of place Jessica would choose, not because she loved the house, but because she loved what the address would say about her success. "The thing is," she continued, "the timing works out perfectly because it means we'll finally have space to help family members who might be struggling with their living situations." There it was, the setup I'd been expecting all evening. Jessica wasn't just announcing her success. She was positioning herself as the family savior, the successful sister who could rescue her pathetic sibling from a life of small-town mediocrity. "What do you mean?" Dad asked, though I could tell from his expression that he had a pretty good idea where this was heading. "Well, Sarah's been living at home for 5 years now, and while I know you and Mom have enjoyed having her around, I think we all agree that it's time for her to start building an independent life." Jessica's voice was warm and caring, the tone of someone offering generous assistance. "The house in Lake Oswego has a beautiful guest suite that would be perfect for Sarah while she gets established in Portland." The silence that followed was loaded with assumptions. Mom looked pleased at the idea of her daughters living closer together. Dad looked relieved at the prospect of me finally launching into adult independence. Brian nodded approvingly, probably calculating how much money they'd save by having live-in childcare when they started their family. Of course, Jessica added, Sarah would need to find work in Portland, but I'm confident we can help with that. My company is always looking for administrative support, and Brian's firm occasionally needs junior staff for client services. Administrative support. Client services. The condescension was breathtaking in its completeness. Here was Jessica, offering to rescue me from my pathetic life by giving me the opportunity to answer her phones or fetch coffee for Brian's clients. She was so convinced of her own generosity that she couldn't see how insulting her offer actually was. That's very thoughtful of you, I said carefully, but I'm not really looking to leave Riverside right now. Jessica's smile tightened slightly. Sarah, I understand that change can be scary, but sometimes we have to push ourselves outside our comfort zones. You can't spend your whole life organizing senior activities and living in your childhood bedroom. Why not? I asked. What if I'm happy with my life the way it is? Are you, though? Jessica leaned forward, her expression earnest and concerned. Are you really happy working a dead-end job for barely above minimum wage? Are you really fulfilled living with our parents at 28? Are you really satisfied with a life that has no growth potential, no future prospects, no real achievements to show for all your education and intelligence? Each question was designed to highlight my supposed failures, to force me to admit that my life was as pathetic as she believed it to be. The strategy would have worked 5 years ago, when I was fresh out of community college and genuinely uncertain about my future. But now, sitting across from Jessica while she enumerated my shortcomings, I felt nothing but amusement at how completely she'd misunderstood everything. You know what, Jess? I said, signaling the server for more water. You're absolutely right. I'm not really happy with my current situation. Her face lit up with triumph. Finally, her stubborn little sister was seeing reason. I'm glad you're ready to be honest about it, she said. Change is hard, but it's the only way to grow. Oh, I'm definitely ready for change, I said. In fact, change is coming whether I'm ready for it or not. Jessica frowned slightly, sensing something in my tone that didn't match her expectation of defeated acceptance. What do you mean? I mean, tomorrow's going to be very different from today. For all of us? Sarah, you're being cryptic again. Jessica's voice held a note of frustration. If you have something to say, just say it. I looked around the table at my family. Dad, who'd taught me the value of hard work and long-term thinking. Mom, who'd always supported my choices even when she didn't understand them. Jessica, who'd spent 5 years convinced that success meant impressing other people, rather than building something sustainable. And Brian, who'd built his career on managing other people's money while apparently failing to manage his own firm's regulatory compliance. Tomorrow, the Riverside Gazette would run the story about the historic district designation. Tomorrow, real estate agents would start calling property owners in the affected neighborhoods. Tomorrow, Jessica would begin to understand that her assumptions about success, ambition, and her little sister's capabilities had been fundamentally wrong. But tonight, she could enjoy her moment of superiority one last time. You're right, I said. I shouldn't be cryptic. Let me be perfectly clear. I'm not interested in your guest suite, your job offers, or your advice about my life choices. But I appreciate the concern. Jessica's face flushed slightly. Sarah, I'm trying to help you. We all want what's best for you, but you have to be willing to help yourself. I have been helping myself, I said. For the past 3 years, actually. You just haven't been paying attention. What are you talking about? Before I could answer, the server appeared with our entrees. Jessica had ordered the most expensive steak on the menu, Brian had chosen the lobster, and I'd ordered the salmon special. As we sorted out who got which plate, the tension at the table ratcheted up another notch. Let's just enjoy our dinner, Mom said diplomatically. We can talk about the future later. But Jessica wasn't ready to let it go. She'd planned this evening as a showcase of her success and her generous offer to rescue her struggling sister. And my refusal to play along was ruining the script she'd written in her head. Sarah, she said, cutting into her steak with more force than necessary, I don't understand why you're being so resistant to opportunities that could completely change your life. Maybe because my life doesn't need the kind of change you're offering. Working at a community center in a town with no future isn't a life, it's just marking time until you figure out what you really want to do. And what if what I really want to do is exactly what I'm already doing? Jessica set down her fork and stared at me with the expression she'd worn when we were kids, and I'd said something that made no sense to her sophisticated understanding of the world. Sarah, be realistic. You make maybe $30,000 a year organizing craft activities for old people. You live in your childhood bedroom. You drive a car that's older than some of your coworkers. You have no savings, no investment portfolio, no retirement planning, no assets of any kind. That's not a life plan, that's just existing. The accuracy of her assumptions was startling. She'd clearly given considerable thought to the details of my supposed financial situation, building a complete picture of my poverty based on the limited information she had access to. What made it even more impressive was how completely wrong she was about every single detail. My salary at the community center was actually $45,000 a year, not $30,000, though the difference was irrelevant given my other income sources. I did live in my childhood bedroom, but by choice rather than necessity. My car was indeed older, but paid for and reliable, which freed up money for more important investments. And as for savings, investment portfolio, retirement planning, and assets, well, tomorrow she'd learn exactly how wrong she was about those assumptions. You're right about the car, I said. It is pretty old. Jessica looked relieved, thinking she'd finally gotten through to me. But everything else you just said is complete nonsense. What? The part about no savings, no investments, no assets, no future prospects. The part about organizing craft activities for old people. The part about Riverside having no future. The part about me not having a real life plan. I took a bite of salmon, chewing thoughtfully. Pretty much everything you think you know about my life is wrong. Brian looked up from his lobster, finally paying attention to our conversation. Dad stopped pretending to focus on his dinner and leaned forward slightly. Mom's expression shifted from diplomatic concern to genuine curiosity. Sarah, Jessica said slowly, what exactly are you saying? I'm saying that making assumptions about people can be dangerous. I'm saying that success doesn't always look like what you expect it to look like. And I'm saying that sometimes the person you think needs rescuing is actually doing just fine on their own. That's very philosophical, but it doesn't change the facts about your situation. You're absolutely right, I said. It doesn't change the facts. It just changes which facts you're aware of. Jessica stared at me for a long moment, clearly trying to decode what I was telling her. The problem was that the truth was so far outside her expectations that she couldn't even begin to guess what she was missing. Are you saying you have some kind of secret income? She asked finally. Because if you're doing something illegal— Nothing illegal, I said quickly. Everything completely legitimate, properly documented, and fully compliant with all applicable regulations. Then what? I glanced around the table again. Tomorrow, they'd all know the truth. Tomorrow, Jessica's entire understanding of our family dynamic would be turned upside down. Tomorrow, the sister she'd been trying to rescue would reveal that she didn't need rescuing from anyone. But tonight, I could give her just enough information to keep her awake wondering what she'd missed. Let's just say that working at the community center has given me access to information and opportunities that most people don't know about. And let's say that I've been very good at recognizing the value of those opportunities. What kind of opportunities? The kind that require patience, long-term thinking, and the ability to see potential where other people see problems. Jessica's frustration was mounting. Sarah, stop being mysterious and just tell us what you're talking about. I'm talking about the difference between playing the game everyone else is playing and creating your own game entirely. I'm talking about the difference between chasing quarterly profits and building generational wealth. I'm talking about the difference between looking successful and actually being successful. You're not making any sense. I'm making perfect sense. You're just not listening to the right parts. The rest of dinner passed in uncomfortable tension. Jessica made several more attempts to get me to explain my cryptic comments, but I deflected each one with vague references to business opportunities and investment strategies. By the time we finished dessert, she was practically vibrating with frustration at her inability to crack the puzzle I'd presented. As we waited for the check, Jessica made one final attempt to reassert control over the narrative she'd constructed about our family dynamics. "Sarah, I hope you'll think seriously about my offer," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled irritation. "The guest suite will be available whenever you're ready to stop playing games and start building a real future." "I appreciate that," I said, standing up to put on my jacket. "But I should probably warn you that by next week, my definition of real future might be very different from yours." "What's that supposed to mean?" I smiled at her across the table, the same smile I'd worn at Uncle Tom's barbecue when she'd called me pathetic for living at home. "It means you should probably read tomorrow's newspaper," I said. "Local section. There's going to be a story that I think you'll find very interesting." As we walked out to the parking lot, Jessica grabbed my arm just outside the restaurant door. "Sarah, what's going on? And don't give me another cryptic answer. I know something's happening, and I know you're not telling me what it is." For a moment I considered telling her everything. I considered explaining about the property acquisitions, the development strategy, the historic district designation, and the transformation that was about to sweep through Riverside. I considered describing the meeting with the city council, the projections for property value increases, and the investment portfolio that would soon make her Portland condo look like a modest starter home. But then I remembered 5 years of condescending comments, dismissive laughter, and assumptions about my lack of ambition. I remembered every time she'd made it clear that she considered me a failure, every suggestion that I needed her help to build a real life, every moment when she'd positioned herself as the successful sister who'd figured out how the world really worked. "Tomorrow, Jess," I said, gently pulling my arm free. "Read the local section of tomorrow's newspaper, and then we can talk about building real futures." I left her standing in the parking lot, staring after me with the expression of someone who'd just realized that the puzzle she'd been trying to solve was far more complicated than she'd imagined. Tomorrow she'd understand exactly how complicated it really was. But tonight she could go home to her hotel room and wonder what her pathetic little sister had been building while she was busy collecting corporate achievements and planning her rescue mission. Tomorrow would bring clarity. Tonight brought anticipation. And for the first time in 5 years, I was looking forward to a conversation with my sister. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October sunshine that made everything look like a postcard. I was already dressed and drinking coffee in the kitchen when Dad came downstairs at 6:30, earlier than usual for a man who'd been retired for 2 years. He moved quietly, trying not to wake Mom or Jessica, but I could tell from his expression that he hadn't slept well. "Morning, Dad," I said, pouring him a cup from the fresh pot I'd made. "Morning, sweetheart." He settled into his usual chair at the kitchen table, the same spot where he'd eaten breakfast for 30 years. "You're up early." "Big day ahead," I said, which was the understatement of the century. Dad studied my face with the careful attention he'd always given to details that didn't quite add up. He'd spent 3 decades running Mitchell Hardware, and successful small business owners developed a sixth sense for when something important was happening just outside their field of vision. "Sarah," he said slowly, "last night at dinner you said some things that got me thinking." "Oh yeah? You mentioned reading today's newspaper. Something about a story in the local section." I nodded, sipping my coffee and waiting for him to continue. "And you've been different lately. Not unhappy different, just focused. Like you're working towards something specific." Dad had always been observant, but I was surprised he'd picked up on the subtle changes in my behavior over the past few months. I'd thought I'd been careful to maintain my usual routine, but apparently a lifetime of living in the same house made it impossible to hide everything from someone who knew you that well. "What if I told you that everything you think you know about my life is about to change?" I asked. Dad's eyebrows went up slightly. "I'd say that's either very good news or very concerning news, and I'd want to know which one it is." "It's good news, Dad. Really good news." "For you?" "For all of us." He was quiet for a moment, processing this information in the methodical way he'd always approached problems at the hardware store. Dad believed in understanding all the variables before making decisions, and right now he was clearly missing several crucial variables. "Does this have anything to do with why Jessica's been so frustrated with you lately?" I almost laughed at the question. Jessica's frustration was about to reach levels she'd never experienced before, but not for the reasons she expected. Jessica's frustrated because she thinks she understands my life, and I've been letting her think that. But today, her understanding is going to get a major update. Should I be worried? Only if you're worried about your daughter being more successful than you ever imagined possible. Dad's expression shifted from concern to curiosity. He'd raised 2 daughters who'd both inherited his work ethic and his ability to think strategically, but he'd watched one chase conventional success while the other seemed content with a simple life. Now I was telling him that his assessment of the situation might have been completely wrong. "Sarah," he said carefully, "are you saying you've been working on something bigger than your job at the community center?" "Much bigger." "How much bigger?" I was saved from answering by the sound of footsteps on the stairs. Jessica appeared in the kitchen doorway wearing silk pajamas and the kind of perfectly arranged bedhead that probably took 20 minutes to achieve. Her expression was tight with the residual frustration from last night's dinner, and I could tell she'd spent most of the night trying to decode my cryptic comments. "Good morning," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Morning, Jess. Sleep well?" "Fine." She poured herself coffee and sat down across from me, her movements precise and controlled. "I've been thinking about our conversation last night." "Which part?" "The part where you kept making mysterious comments about tomorrow's newspaper and business opportunities and building real futures." Dad looked between us with growing interest. He could sense the tension in the room, but he didn't understand its source or its likely resolution. "And?" I prompted. "And I think you're playing some kind of game to avoid dealing with the reality of your situation. Last night you acted like you had some kind of secret success story, but this morning you're still sitting in our parents' kitchen wearing the same clothes you've worn for the past 5 years. Jessica's voice had that patient, older sister tone that used to make me feel small and defensive. But this morning, it just made me smile. "You're right," I said. "I am still sitting in our parents' kitchen. And these clothes are definitely not new. So what was all that nonsense about reading today's newspaper?" I glanced at the clock on the microwave. 7:15. The Riverside Gazette would be hitting driveways and newsstands within the next hour, carrying the story that would transform everything Jessica thought she knew about her little sister's life. "It wasn't nonsense," I said. "But you'll understand that better once you've read the story." "What story?" "The one about the historic district designation that the city council approved yesterday afternoon." Jessica frowned, clearly not understanding why I thought she'd be interested in local zoning decisions. "Sarah, I don't care about Riverside's municipal planning. I care about your refusal to take responsibility for your life. Those 2 things are more connected than you realize." "How?" Instead of answering, I stood up and walked to the front door, retrieving the newspaper from the porch where the delivery driver had left it 20 minutes earlier. The headline was exactly what I'd expected. City Council approves historic district designation for downtown Riverside. Below that, in smaller text, development project expected to bring millions in investment to local community. I returned to the kitchen and spread the newspaper on the table, folding it so the headline was clearly visible. Jessica glanced at it dismissively. "See?" I said. "Historic district designation, approved yesterday." "So?" "So read the article." Jessica sighed with exaggerated patience, but she leaned forward and began reading. Dad moved his chair closer so he could see the newspaper, his expression growing more curious by the minute. The article was comprehensive, covering everything from the financial details of the development grants to the timeline for infrastructure improvements. It mentioned the expected impact on property values, the types of businesses that would be attracted to the restored historic district, and the potential for significant economic growth throughout Riverside. "This is nice for the town," Jessica said when she finished reading, "but I still don't understand what it has to do with you." "Keep reading," I said. "There's a sidebar article about local property ownership in the affected area." Jessica found the smaller article, which listed some of the major property owners who would benefit from the historic district designation. The list included several longtime Riverside families, a few small investment companies, and near the bottom, Riverside Heritage Properties, LLC. Riverside Heritage Properties, Jessica read aloud. Owner of 7 properties in the designated historic district, with an estimated combined value of... She stopped reading and looked up at me with confusion. $2.4 million? Estimated value before the designation, I corrected. The actual current value is probably closer to $3.8 million, and it'll go up from there as development proceeds. Sarah, why are you showing me this? Because Riverside Heritage Properties is my company. The silence that followed was absolute. Dad's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. Jessica stared at me like I'd just spoken in a foreign language. Even the clock on the microwave seemed to pause in the sudden stillness of the kitchen. What? Jessica's voice was barely a whisper. Riverside Heritage Properties. I founded it 3 years ago as a limited liability company focused on acquiring undervalued properties in areas with high development potential. I currently own 7 properties in Riverside's new historic district, including the Victorian house at 247 Maple Street. Jessica blinked rapidly, trying to process this information. What house at 247 Maple Street? This house, I said simply. The house you've been making fun of me for living in. The house you think I'm too pathetic to leave. I bought it from Mom and Dad 18 months ago. Dad's coffee cup finally completed its journey to the table, landing with a soft clink that seemed unnaturally loud in the stunned silence. You bought our house? Jessica's voice cracked slightly on the last word. I bought their house, I corrected. It's my house now, has been for a year and a half. Mom and Dad are my tenants, though I don't charge them rent because they're family, and because Dad helped me understand the local real estate market when I was first getting started. Jessica turned to stare at Dad, who was nodding slowly as pieces of a puzzle he'd been working on for months finally started falling into place. You knew about this? She asked him. I helped her with the paperwork, Dad admitted. Sarah came to me 2 years ago with a business plan that was more sophisticated than anything I'd seen in 30 years of running a hardware store. She'd identified development patterns, analyzed municipal budgets, studied demographic trends, and calculated risk assessments that would have impressed any bank loan officer. But you never said anything, Sarah asked me not to. She wanted to prove herself before anyone knew what she was building. Jessica turned back to me, her expression cycling through confusion, disbelief, and the beginning of something that might have been anger. You've been lying to us for 3 years? I've been working for 3 years, I said. I never lied about anything. I just didn't volunteer information that you never asked for and wouldn't have believed anyway. What do you mean I wouldn't have believed it? Jess, you spent last night lecturing me about my lack of savings, my absence of investment portfolio, and my complete failure to build any kind of financial future. Would you have believed me if I'd told you I owned nearly $4 million worth of real estate? She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again as the full implications of what I'd told her began to sink in. $4 million, she repeated slowly, and growing. The historic district designation will probably add another $1 million to the portfolio value within 6 months, and that's before we start developing any of the properties. We? David and I. He's my business partner. Has been from the beginning. Jessica's face was cycling through emotions I'd never seen before. The sister who'd spent 5 years pitying my lack of ambition was discovering that I'd been building wealth at a rate that dwarfed her corporate achievements. David Chin, she said. Your boyfriend who works at the community center. David Chin, urban planning consultant and co-founder of Riverside Heritage Properties. He works at the community center 1 day a week as a favor to his aunt. The rest of the time, he's analyzing development opportunities and managing our property acquisitions. This is insane. Jessica stood up abruptly, pacing to the kitchen window and back. You're telling me that while I've been working 60-hour weeks to build my career, you've been secretly building a real estate empire? I'm telling you that while you've been working 60-hour weeks to impress other people, I've been working to build something that would last. And you never thought to mention this? When would I have mentioned it? During one of your lectures about my lack of ambition? While you were explaining how pathetic my life choices were? When you were offering to let me live in your guest suite and answer phones at your office? Jessica flinched at the reminder of her condescending offer from the night before. I was trying to help you. You were trying to feel superior to me. There's a difference. Dad cleared his throat gently. Maybe we should all take a step back and... No, Jessica interrupted, turning back to face me. I want to understand this. You're saying you've been pretending to be a failure while actually building a multi-million-dollar business? I haven't been pretending anything. I work at the community center because I love the work, and because it gives me access to information about neighborhood developments. I live in this house because it's a smart financial decision, and because I enjoy being close to family. I drive an older car because it's reliable and paid for, which frees up capital for investments. But you let me think you were struggling. I let you think what you wanted to think. You never asked about my finances, my business interests, or my long-term plans. You just assumed I was failing because my life didn't look like yours. Jessica sat back down heavily, staring at the newspaper article like it might change if she looked at it long enough. This house is really yours? Want to see the deed? Before she could answer, I went to the home office Dad had set up in what used to be our old playroom and retrieved the folder containing all the property documents. When I returned to the kitchen, I spread the deed across the table next to the newspaper. Jessica stared at the official document with her name listed as the sole owner of 247 Maple Street, Riverside, Oregon. The purchase price, the closing date, the legal description of the property, all of it clearly documented in the kind of bureaucratic language that left no room for misinterpretation. Oh my God, she whispered. You really do own our house. My house, I corrected gently. Though you're welcome to visit any time. She looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger, not confusion, but something closer to awe, mixed with a healthy dose of shame. Sarah, I owe you an apology. You owe me several apologies. But we can start with just one. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for assuming I knew what your life was like. I'm sorry for thinking you needed rescuing. I'm sorry for calling you pathetic, and for suggesting you were wasting your potential. Thank you. But I still don't understand how you did this. How did you know the historic district designation would happen? How did you identify which properties to buy? How did you finance 7 real estate purchases on a community center salary? These were good questions, the kind of analytical thinking that had made Jessica successful in her corporate career. Now that the shock was wearing off, her business mind was engaging with the puzzle of how I'd accomplish something she'd considered impossible. I didn't finance 7 purchases on my salary alone, I said. The first property was financed through a combination of my savings, a small business loan, and a private investment from David's family. Once that property started appreciating in value, I used the equity to finance the second purchase. Then I used the combined equity from the first 2 properties to buy the third, and so on. Leveraging appreciation for acquisition capital, Jessica said, recognizing the investment strategy. Exactly. By the time I bought this house from Mom and Dad, I had enough equity in my other properties to pay cash. And you knew about the historic district designation in advance? I knew it was being discussed. David and I attended city council meetings for 3 years, studying the development proposals and understanding the political dynamics. We didn't know for certain that it would be approved, but we calculated that the probability was high enough to justify the investment risk. Jessica shook her head slowly. This is the kind of strategic thinking they teach in graduate-level business courses. It's the kind of strategic thinking that works in the real world, regardless of where you learn it. Dad had been listening to our conversation with growing pride and amazement. Sarah, I knew you were smart, but this is extraordinary. Thanks, Dad. I learned most of it from watching you run the hardware store. You always said the key to business success was understanding your market better than your competitors did. But I never built anything like this. You built something different but equally valuable. You built trust in the community, relationships with customers, and a reputation for reliability that lasted 30 years. I built on that foundation. Jessica was quiet for several minutes, reading through the property documents and absorbing the reality of what I'd accomplished. When she finally looked up, her expression had shifted from shock to something approaching respect. The promotion I was celebrating last night, she said quietly. My new client portfolio worth $12 million? Yeah? You own almost $4 million in assets personally. As in, you own them outright, not just managing them for other people. That's correct. And your net worth is going to keep growing as property values increase. That's the plan. Jessica was quiet again, and I could see her recalculating everything she thought she knew about success, ambition, and which of us had built the more impressive career. Sarah, she said finally, I feel like an idiot. You're not an idiot. You just made assumptions based on limited information. I called you pathetic. Yeah, you did. I offered to let you live in my guest suite and get you a job answering phones. Yeah, you did that too. While you were secretly wealthier than me. While I was building something that would make me significantly wealthier than you, yes. Jessica buried her face in her hands. This is humiliating. It doesn't have to be, I said. It could just be educational. What do you mean? I mean, you could learn something from this experience about the difference between appearing successful and actually building wealth. About the value of understanding local markets instead of just following national trends. About the importance of asking questions instead of making assumptions. Are you offering to teach me? I'm offering to include you if you're interested in learning how this really works, instead of just being embarrassed about how wrong you were. Jessica looked up. Surprised. Include me how? David and I have been discussing expansion opportunities in other Oregon towns that are following similar development patterns. We could use a partner with corporate finance experience and connections to institutional investors. You want me to join your real estate company? I want you to decide whether you're more interested in managing other people's money or building wealth of your own. Jessica stared at me for a long moment, processing this unexpected offer. The sister she'd been trying to rescue was now offering to help her build something bigger than anything she'd accomplished in her corporate career. What about Brian? What about my job in Portland? What about the house in Lake Oswego? Those are your decisions to make. But I'd suggest you think carefully about whether the life you've been building is actually the life you want, or just the life you thought you were supposed to want. Meaning, yesterday you were lecturing me about building a real future. Today you're discovering that I built exactly the kind of future you thought was impossible. Maybe it's time to reconsider what's actually possible when you stop trying to impress other people and start focusing on creating something that lasts. Jessica was quiet for several more minutes, and I could see her working through the implications of everything she'd learned. The sister she'd pitied was now offering her opportunities she'd never imagined. The life she'd dismissed as pathetic was actually more successful than the one she'd spent 5 years building. Can I think about it? She asked finally. Take all the time you need, but remember that real estate development moves quickly once it gets started. If you want in, you'll need to make decisions at the speed of opportunity, not at the speed of corporate committees. I understand. Dad had been listening to our entire conversation with the expression of someone watching a movie where the plot had taken several unexpected turns. Sarah, he said, I'm proud of you. Not just for the business success, but for the way you're handling the situation with your sister. Thanks, Dad. And Jessica, I'm proud of you too. It takes courage to admit when you've been wrong about something this fundamental. Jessica nodded, though she still looked shaken by the morning's revelations. There's one more thing, I said, pulling out my phone. David should be here in about 20 minutes. We have a meeting with a developer who's interested in partnering with us on the Main Street renovation project. Here? At the house? At my house, yes. The dining room works perfectly as a conference room, and it's more impressive than you might expect when potential partners realize they're meeting with someone who owns the property where the meeting is taking place. You're meeting with developers? We're meeting with developers, investors, contractors, and city planners on a regular basis. Riverside Heritage Properties isn't just a property holding company, Jess. We're actively involved in shaping how this town's development unfolds. I had no idea. You had no idea because you never asked. You assumed my life was small and simple, so you never looked closely enough to see what was actually happening. Jessica nodded slowly. I see that now. The question is what you're going to do with that knowledge. Before she could answer, we heard a car pulling into the driveway. David was right on time, which meant our meeting with the developer would begin in a few minutes. I gathered up the property documents and the newspaper, preparing to transition from family drama to business strategy. Do you want to sit in on the meeting? I asked Jessica. Just to observe? She looked surprised. You'd let me do that? You might find it educational. Especially if you're serious about considering my offer. I am serious. Then come learn what building real wealth actually looks like. As David's footsteps approached the front door, I realized that this was the moment everything truly changed. Not just Jessica's understanding of my life, but our entire family dynamic. The sister who'd been trying to rescue me was about to watch me conduct business at a level she'd never imagined possible. Yesterday, I'd been the pathetic sister who lived at home and organized craft activities. Today, I was a multimillionaire real estate developer who owned the home where we were about to host a meeting that could transform Riverside's economic future. The best part was that I'd accomplished all of it, while letting Jessica believe exactly what she wanted to believe about my capabilities and ambitions. Sometimes the most satisfying victories are the ones where you win so completely that even your opponents have to respect how thoroughly they underestimated you. Jessica was about to learn that lesson in the most direct way possible, and I was going to enjoy every minute of watching her discover who her little sister really was. 6 months later, I was standing in what had once been Dad's old hardware store, watching construction crews install floor-to-ceiling windows that would transform the space into Riverside's first boutique coffee roastery. The morning sun streamed through the openings, where dusty display shelves had stood for 3 decades, illuminating the exposed brick walls and polished concrete floors that would soon host the kind of urban professionals who commuted from Portland for the authentic small-town experience. The transformation of Main Street had exceeded even David's most optimistic projections. What we'd calculated as a 5-year development timeline had compressed into 18 months of controlled chaos, with construction crews, city planners, and business owners working in carefully orchestrated harmony to rebuild Riverside's commercial district. Property values had tripled within the first quarter after the historic district designation, and tourism revenue was already showing the kind of sustained growth that attracted serious investors. Jessica appeared in the doorway of the former hardware store, wearing work boots and paint-splattered jeans that would have been unthinkable during her corporate days. She'd traded her Portland condo for a converted loft above what would soon be Riverside's premier art gallery, and her investment banking career for a hands-on role managing the commercial development side of our rapidly expanding business. The permits for the Riverside Pavilion just came through, she called out, dodging a carpenter carrying lumber toward the back of the space. Construction starts Monday, and we're on track for the summer opening. I nodded, making a mental note to review the pavilion contracts later. The Riverside Pavilion had been David's idea, a multi-use event space that would host everything from wedding receptions to corporate retreats, taking advantage of Riverside's scenic location, while providing another revenue stream for our growing hospitality portfolio. Any word from the Portland investors? They're in for the full amount, Jessica said, approaching with the kind of confident stride she'd once reserved for boardroom presentations. $25 million for Phase 2 development, plus they want to discuss expansion opportunities in 3 other Oregon towns. It was strange how naturally Jessica had adapted to the real estate development world. The analytical skills that had made her successful in corporate finance translated perfectly to project management and investor relations, but with a personal investment component that gave her work meaning beyond quarterly profit reports. She'd discovered that building something tangible felt different from managing other people's abstract financial instruments. Speaking of expansion, she continued, I had an interesting conversation with Mayor Patterson this morning. About Salem. Apparently, they've been watching what we accomplished here in Riverside, and they're interested in discussing a similar historic preservation project for their downtown district. Salem was a significantly larger market than Riverside, with the kind of established infrastructure and political connections that could support development projects on a scale we'd never attempted. It was also the kind of opportunity that required the sort of institutional investor relationships Jessica had cultivated during her banking career. What's the timeline? Preliminary discussions next month. Feasibility study by spring. Potential groundbreaking within 2 years if everything aligns properly. I was quiet for a moment, considering the implications of expanding our operations to include Oregon's capital city. It would mean hiring additional staff, establishing relationships with Salem's political and business communities, and taking on projects with budgets that dwarfed anything we'd tackled in Riverside. What do you think? Jessica asked. Ready to become a statewide operation? Are you? She grinned, and for a moment I saw traces of the ambitious sister who dominated our childhood competitions and refused to accept limitations on what she could accomplish. I've spent the last 6 months learning that I didn't know anything about building real wealth, she said. I'm not ready to stop learning now. David emerged from the back room of the former hardware store, carrying architectural plans and wearing the focused expression that meant he'd been solving complex logistical problems for several hours. How's the timeline looking? I asked. On schedule for the coffee roastery opening next month, ahead of schedule for the gallery renovation, and slightly behind schedule for the restaurant build-out. He spread the plans across a makeshift table constructed from sawhorses and plywood. The restaurant delay is actually good news, though. It gives us time to incorporate the feedback from the focus groups. The restaurant had been the most ambitious component of our Main Street renovation, a farm-to-table concept that would showcase local ingredients while providing the kind of dining experience that attracted food tourists from Portland and Seattle. We'd hired a chef whose previous restaurant had earned national recognition, and the advance reservations were already booked solid through the summer. Any issues with the investor group? They're thrilled. Return on investment is tracking 20% above initial projections, and that's before we factor in the increased property values for the residential portfolio. The residential portfolio had become the unexpected star of our Riverside development strategy. While we'd focused most of our attention on commercial properties, the historic homes we'd acquired and renovated were now worth more per square foot than comparable properties in some Portland neighborhoods. Young professionals were moving to Riverside for the lower cost of living and the small town charm, then commuting to Portland for work that could increasingly be done remotely. Sarah, Jessica said, can I ask you something? Sure. Do you ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't been such an arrogant fool about your life choices? It was a question she'd asked in various forms over the past 6 months. Usually when we were reviewing financial reports that demonstrated just how wrong her assumptions had been about the relationship between conventional success and actual wealth building. What do you mean? I mean, if I'd paid attention to what you were actually doing instead of dismissing it, we could have been partners from the beginning. We could have built this together instead of you having to prove yourself while I made condescending comments about your lack of ambition. Maybe, I said. But maybe you needed to learn some humility before you were ready to be a real partner instead of just another investor looking for quick returns. You think I was too arrogant to be useful 3 years ago? I think you were too focused on impressing other people to understand the difference between building wealth and performing success. Jessica nodded thoughtfully. She'd spent considerable time over the past 6 months reflecting on the gap between her corporate achievements and the kind of long-term thinking that had enabled my real estate success. The thing that bothers me most, she said, is that I was so convinced I understood how business worked, but I completely missed the biggest opportunity right in front of me. You didn't miss it? I corrected. You just weren't ready for it yet. What's the difference? The difference is that now you understand why patience and local knowledge matter more than impressive credentials. You understand why building relationships in a community creates more value than networking at corporate events. You understand why owning assets beats managing other people's assets every single time, and you think I didn't understand those things before? I think you understood them intellectually, but you hadn't lived them. There's a difference between knowing something and knowing something. David looked up from the architectural plans he'd been reviewing. She's right, you know. The Jessica who offered Sarah a job answering phones 6 months ago wouldn't have been able to handle the Salem project. Why not? Because the Salem project requires the kind of strategic thinking that comes from understanding how communities actually work, not just how financial markets work. You had to learn to see value where other people see problems, to build relationships instead of just managing transactions, to think in decades instead of quarters. Jessica was quiet for several minutes, absorbing this assessment of her professional evolution. The silence was broken by the sound of heavy machinery starting up outside, where crews were installing new streetlights that would illuminate Main Street's historic facades in the evening. Can I tell you something? She said finally. Of course. I'm happier now than I ever was in Portland. Not just professionally, but personally. This work feels real in a way that managing investment portfolios never did. Because you're building something instead of just optimizing someone else's assets? Because I'm building something that matters to real people in a real place. When we renovate a historic building, families get to live and work in spaces that connect them to their community's history. When we attract new businesses to Main Street, longtime residents get to see their town come back to life. When we increase property values, homeowners who've lived here for decades suddenly have wealth they never expected. It was exactly the kind of thinking that had motivated my original investment strategy, the understanding that successful development creates value for entire communities, rather than just extracting profit for distant investors. Plus, Jessica added with a grin, I get to work with my sister instead of competing with her. You were never really competing with me, I said. You were competing with your own insecurities about what constitutes real success. Harsh, but accurate. I try to be both. David folded up the architectural plans and checked his watch. Speaking of real success, we should probably head over to City Hall for the 3:00 meeting. The 3:00 meeting was with a delegation from the Oregon Economic Development Department, who were documenting Riverside's transformation as a potential model for similar projects throughout the state. Our success had attracted attention from urban planners, economists, and policymakers, who wanted to understand how a small town could generate significant economic growth without sacrificing its historic character or displacing longtime residents. Are you nervous? Jessica asked as we walked the 4 blocks to City Hall through streets that bore little resemblance to the sleepy downtown I'd known growing up. About the meeting, no. About the responsibility that comes with being a model for other communities? A little. Meaning? Meaning if we get this wrong, if we prioritize profit over community benefit, if we become just another gentrification story, we'll have wasted an opportunity to prove that development can actually strengthen communities instead of destroying them. No pressure, David said dryly. Exactly. City Hall had been renovated as part of the Historic District project, its 1920s facade restored to its original grandeur, while the interior was updated with modern technology and accessibility features. The conference room where we met with state officials overlooked Main Street, providing a perfect view of the construction projects and new businesses that demonstrated Riverside's economic renaissance. The meeting lasted 2 hours and covered everything from our financing strategies to our community engagement processes. The state officials were particularly interested in how we'd managed to increase property values without displacing longtime residents, a challenge that had proven insurmountable in many other development projects. The key, I explained, was involving existing residents in the planning process from the beginning. Instead of treating them as obstacles to development, we treated them as partners who understood the community's needs and priorities. Can you give us a specific example? Asked Dr. Martinez, the lead economist for the State Development Department. Mrs. Rodriguez, who runs the senior lunch program at the community center. She'd lived in Riverside for 40 years and had watched Main Street decline as businesses closed and young people moved away. When we started planning the commercial renovations, we asked her what kinds of businesses the community actually needed. And what did she say? She said Riverside needed a pharmacy, a hardware store, and a place where teenagers could hang out after school that wasn't the parking lot behind the old grocery store. Dr. Martinez smiled. And did you deliver on those needs? We did better than that. We delivered on those needs while creating business opportunities for community members. Mrs. Rodriguez's nephew opened the new pharmacy, Mr. Patterson's daughter took over the hardware store space, and the teen center is staffed by high school students who earn college scholarships through the program. So you addressed community needs while creating local employment and ownership opportunities. We addressed community needs by creating local employment and ownership opportunities. The two goals weren't separate. They were the same goal approached from different angles. The state officials spent considerable time discussing our approach to balancing investor returns with community benefit, a topic that had become central to current debates about sustainable development. Traditional real estate investment focused primarily on maximizing financial returns, often at the expense of existing communities. Our model demonstrated that community benefit and investor returns could be mutually reinforcing when projects were designed thoughtfully. What advice would you give to other communities considering similar development strategies? Dr. Martinez asked. Jessica leaned forward, and I realized she was about to answer a question that 6 months ago she wouldn't have been qualified to address. Start with listening, she said. Not market research or demographic analysis, but actual listening to the people who live and work in the community you're trying to improve. They understand things about local needs and opportunities that don't show up in any database. And then think in decades instead of quarters. Real community development takes time, and the most valuable outcomes often aren't visible in the first year, or even the first 5 years. If you're looking for quick returns, invest in something else. Finally, I added, remember that sustainable development requires sustainable communities. If your project displaces the people who made a place worth investing in, you haven't created value, you've just relocated it. The meeting concluded with requests for additional documentation about our financing models and community engagement strategies. As the state officials prepared to leave, Dr. Martinez shook hands with each of us and made a comment that stayed with me for the rest of the day. What you've accomplished here, she said, proves that intelligent development can strengthen communities instead of disrupting them. That's not just good business, it's good citizenship. After the officials left, Jessica, David, and I walked back through downtown Riverside in the late afternoon sunshine. The streets were busy, with construction workers finishing their shifts, new business owners preparing for evening customers, and longtime residents enjoying the revitalized energy of their transformed community. Can I ask you something? Jessica said as we paused outside the renovated coffee shop that would open next week. Sure. Do you think Dad would be proud of what we've done with his old hardware store? I looked through the large windows at the space where Dad had spent 30 years serving customers who needed everything from single screws to major plumbing supplies. The layout was completely different now, designed for coffee roasting and small batch food preparation, but something about the energy felt familiar. I think Dad would be proud that we found a way to honor what he built while creating something new, I said. He always understood that business success comes from serving community needs, not just maximizing profits. Even though it's not a hardware store anymore? Especially because it's not a hardware store anymore? Dad closed Mitchell Hardware because the community's needs had changed, but he couldn't adapt the business model quickly enough to survive. We took the same space and the same community focus, but we adapted to current needs instead of trying to preserve something that was no longer viable. That's a very generous interpretation of gentrification, David said with amusement. It's not gentrification if you're building on existing community strengths instead of replacing them, I replied. Gentrification happens when outside investors extract value from communities by displacing the people who created that value in the first place. What we did was collaborate with existing community members to enhance value that already existed. Is there a difference? Mrs. Rodriguez still lives in the same house she's lived in for 40 years. Except now it's worth 3 times what it was before, and her neighborhood has new businesses that serve her daily needs. That's enhancement, not displacement. We continued walking toward the house, passing new restaurants and renovated storefronts that buzzed with evening activity. Riverside had become the kind of place that attracted visitors from Portland for weekend getaways. But it had also become a more interesting and economically viable place for people who'd lived there for decades. Sarah, Jessica said as we turned onto Maple Street, I want to thank you for something. What? For giving me a chance to be part of this instead of just punishing me for being wrong about everything. You weren't wrong about everything. You were wrong about what my life looked like, but you were right about the importance of building something meaningful. I was right about that? You spent 5 years telling me I needed to develop real ambition and build a substantial future. You were completely correct about that. You just didn't recognize that I was already doing it. Jessica laughed, the first completely unself-conscious laugh I'd heard from her since we were children. So when I was lecturing you about wasting your potential, I was actually motivating you to prove me wrong? When you were lecturing me about wasting my potential, you were helping me understand the difference between building wealth and performing success. I just applied the lesson differently than you expected. By secretly becoming a real estate mogul while letting me think you were organizing craft activities for senior citizens. By building something sustainable while you were focused on building something impressive. We'd reached the house by then, the Victorian home that had sheltered 3 generations of Mitchell family members and now served as both my residence and the headquarters for a multi-million-dollar development company. The evening light made the restored exterior details glow warmly, and I could see Mom in the kitchen window preparing dinner for anyone who wanted to join her. "One more question," Jessica said as we climbed the front porch steps. "Yeah? When you were planning all of this, did you ever imagine it would work out this well?" I paused with my hand on the front door, considering the question seriously. 3 years earlier, when I'd made the first property purchase that started Riverside Heritage Properties, I'd hoped for success, but I'd never imagined the scale of what we'd ultimately accomplish. I imagined building something that would prove I understood the difference between real achievement and impressive credentials, I said finally. I never imagined building something that would change an entire community. And now? Now I understand that the best way to build personal wealth is to create value for other people. The more value we create for Riverside residents and businesses, the more successful our company becomes. It's not a zero-sum game where someone has to lose for us to win. That's the most optimistic business philosophy I've ever heard. It's the most sustainable business philosophy I've ever heard. Jessica opened the front door, and we were greeted by the smell of Mom's pot roast and the sound of Dad discussing baseball scores with David in the living room. It was a scene that could have been from our childhood, except that now the house belonged to me. The business conversation centered on million-dollar development projects. And the sister who'd once called me pathetic was now my partner in building something neither of us could have accomplished alone. 6 months earlier, Jessica had been convinced that success meant impressing other people with quarterly achievements and expensive possessions. Now she understood that real success meant building something that created lasting value for yourself and your community simultaneously. The transformation hadn't been easy for her. Giving up her Portland lifestyle and starting over in Riverside had required the kind of humility she'd never had to develop during her corporate career. But it had also given her the opportunity to build wealth instead of just managing it, to create something meaningful instead of just optimizing someone else's creation. As for me, I'd learned that proving people wrong was satisfying, but including them in building something better was transformative. Jessica's corporate finance skills had accelerated our expansion timeline by years, and her institutional investor relationships had opened opportunities we never could have accessed on our own. Most importantly, we'd both learned that the best revenge against people who underestimate you isn't proving them wrong, it's proving them wrong and then helping them understand why they were wrong and what they can do better next time. That evening, as we sat around the dinner table discussing plans for the Salem project and reviewing financial projections for the next quarter, I realized that the sister who'd once called me pathetic for living at home had become one of the most important contributors to the success I'd built while living at home. The house that had once represented my failure to launch had become the foundation for launching something bigger than either of us had imagined possible. And the sister who'd tried to rescue me from my supposedly pathetic life had discovered that the most satisfying rescue was learning to build something meaningful together. Sometimes the best stories aren't about proving people wrong, they're about helping people understand what they got wrong and then building something better together. Jessica had been wrong about almost everything regarding my life, but she'd been willing to admit her mistakes and learn from them. That willingness to learn had transformed her from the sister who pitied my lack of ambition into the partner who amplified my ability to achieve things neither of us could have accomplished separately. 6 months later, as I looked around the dinner table at my family celebrating another successful week of building something that mattered, I realized that being called pathetic had been the best motivation I could have asked for. It had pushed me to build something so undeniably successful that even my harshest critic had to acknowledge its value. But more than that, it had created the opportunity for Jessica to discover what building real wealth actually looked like, and to become part of something bigger than either of us had ever imagined. The sister who'd called me pathetic for living at home had ended up moving back home herself, not because she'd failed, but because she'd finally understood the difference between building something impressive and building something that lasts. And that understanding had made all the difference. 2 years had passed since that morning when Jessica discovered the deed to our childhood home bore my name instead of our parents'. And the ripple effects of that revelation continued to reshape not just our family dynamics, but the entire economic landscape of Central Oregon. What had started as a small-town real estate venture had evolved into something neither David nor I had originally envisioned: a comprehensive model for sustainable community development that was being studied and replicated across the Pacific Northwest. The irony wasn't lost on me that Jessica, who had once dismissed Riverside as a town with no future, was now spearheading our expansion into markets she'd previously considered beneath her attention. Her transformation from someone who measured success in quarterly bonuses to someone who thought in generational terms had been remarkable to witness. But it was her ability to bridge the gap between institutional finance and community-focused development that had truly distinguished her as a business partner. Standing in the conference room of our new Portland office, overlooking the Willamette River through floor-to-ceiling windows that cost more than most people's annual salaries, I watched Jessica present our Salem project results to a room full of investors who represented more capital than I'd ever imagined accessing. The presentation was flawless, combining hard financial data with compelling stories about community transformation. But what struck me most was how naturally she'd integrated the language of social impact with the metrics that institutional investors demanded. Return on investment for the Salem Historic District project exceeded projections by 37% in year one, she was saying, clicking through slides that showed before and after photographs of renovated buildings alongside detailed financial analysis. But more importantly, local employment increased by 62%, and 89% of new jobs went to existing Salem residents rather than outside hires. The investors nodded approvingly, scribbling notes and murmuring to each other about the implications of sustainable development models that delivered both financial returns and measurable community benefit. These were people who managed pension funds and endowments, whose decisions affected millions of retirees and students, and they were genuinely interested in finding investment opportunities that created long-term value rather than short-term profits. The key differentiator, Jessica continued, is our approach to stakeholder engagement. Instead of viewing existing communities as obstacles to development, we treat them as partners who provide local knowledge and long-term stability that external developers can't replicate. 6 months earlier, Jessica wouldn't have been able to make that statement with conviction, because she wouldn't have understood the practical implications of community partnership. But her hands-on experience managing the Riverside renovations had taught her that successful development required the kind of local relationships that couldn't be built through market research or demographic analysis. After the presentation concluded and the investors began filing out with promises to review our expansion proposals, Jessica and I found ourselves alone in the conference room with David and our newest team member, Maria Santos, who joined us from a sustainable development firm in Seattle. "How do you think that went?" Jessica asked, loosening the structured blazer she'd worn for the presentation. "Better than I expected," Maria said, gathering up the printed materials we'd distributed. The pension fund representative seemed particularly interested in the long-term stability metrics, because they're looking for investments that will still be generating returns when their current beneficiaries are collecting retirement payments, David explained. 20-year performance projections matter more to them than quarterly earnings. It was exactly the kind of long-term thinking that had originally attracted me to real estate development, and it was gratifying to see institutional investors beginning to recognize the value of sustainability over speculation. The housing market crashes and economic volatility of recent years had taught many fund managers that sustainable returns required sustainable communities. "Speaking of long-term projections," Jessica said, "I had an interesting conversation with the mayor of Bend yesterday." Bend was Central Oregon's premier destination city, known for outdoor recreation and craft beer culture, but also increasingly recognized for the kind of economic growth that attracted serious development investment. If we could establish a presence in Bend's market, it would position us as a truly regional operation, with the scale to compete for major projects throughout Oregon and Washington. "What kind of conversation?" I asked. "The kind where she mentioned that Bend's City Council is considering a comprehensive downtown revitalization initiative, and they're looking for development partners who understand how to balance growth with community character preservation." Timeline? Preliminary discussions this fall, formal RFP process early next year, potential project launch within 18 months. Bend represented a significant step up in complexity from our previous projects. While Riverside and Salem had been relatively straightforward historic preservation initiatives, Bend's downtown revitalization would involve coordinating with multiple stakeholder groups, managing environmental regulations related to the Deschutes River corridor, and working within a political framework that included both pro-development and slow-growth constituencies. "Are we ready for that level of complexity?" David asked, voicing the question we were all considering. "Financially, yes," Jessica said. "We have the capital access and the track record. Operationally, it would stretch our current capacity, which means hiring additional staff and probably establishing a Bend office," I added. "Which means making a commitment to becoming a truly regional operation instead of a local company that happens to work in multiple markets." It was the kind of decision that would fundamentally change the nature of our business. For 3 years, we'd operated as an extended family enterprise, with Jessica, David, and me making all major decisions collectively, and maintaining personal relationships with most of our contractors, investors, and municipal partners. Expanding to Bend would require delegating authority, systematizing processes, and accepting the kind of organizational complexity that often compromised the community focus that had made us successful. "What does your gut tell you?" Maria asked, looking at me. I was quiet for several minutes, considering not just the financial implications of expansion, but the personal implications of success at a scale I'd never anticipated. When I'd bought my first property in Riverside's historic district, I'd been motivated by a desire to prove that unconventional approaches could generate superior results. Now we were being invited to prove that community-focused development could work at regional scale. "My gut tells me that we've learned something important about how development can strengthen communities instead of disrupting them," I said finally. "And if we've learned something important, we have an obligation to apply that knowledge where it can make the biggest difference. Even if it means risking what we've already built? Especially if it means risking what we've already built. Static success isn't really success, it's just comfortable stagnation." Jessica smiled at this response, and I realized she was thinking about her own transformation from someone who'd prioritized safety and conventional achievement to someone who was willing to bet her career on unconventional approaches to wealth building. "Besides," I added, "the biggest risk isn't expanding too quickly, it's expanding too slowly, and letting other developers establish footholds in markets where we could make a real difference." Meaning? Meaning, if we don't bring community-focused development to Bend, someone else will bring extraction-focused development to Bend. And 20 years from now, Bend residents will be dealing with the consequences of whichever approach wins out. It was exactly the kind of long-term thinking that had originally motivated my investment in Riverside's future, and it was the same thinking that now motivated our expansion plans. We weren't just building a business, we were demonstrating that alternative approaches to development could generate superior outcomes for all stakeholders. That evening, I drove back to Riverside through the kind of Oregon autumn landscape that made it easy to understand why people moved across the country for the privilege of living in the Pacific Northwest. The hills were painted in shades of gold and crimson, and the late afternoon light made everything look like a postcard advertising the good life in small-town America. Riverside itself had become almost unrecognizable from the sleepy community where I'd grown up. Main Street buzzed with evening activity as new restaurants prepared for dinner service, art galleries hosted opening receptions, and the renovated movie theater advertised independent films alongside Hollywood blockbusters. The changes had happened gradually enough that longtime residents had adapted comfortably, but dramatically enough that visitors often commented on the town's remarkable vitality. I parked in front of the house where Jessica was waiting on the front porch with 2 cups of coffee and the satisfied expression of someone who'd just successfully completed a challenging presentation. "How does it feel to be courted by pension fund managers?" she asked as I settled into the porch swing beside her. "Surreal," I admitted. 3 years ago, you were lecturing me about my lack of professional ambition. Now institutional investors are asking us to manage hundreds of millions of dollars in development projects. 3 years ago, I didn't understand the difference between managing money and building wealth. And now? Now I understand that the most sustainable wealth comes from creating value for other people. The more value we create for communities, the more successful our company becomes. It was exactly the insight that had motivated my original investment strategy, but hearing Jessica articulate it reminded me how completely her understanding of business success had evolved. The sister who'd once measured achievement in salary increases and luxury possessions now thought about generational impact and community benefit. "Can I tell you something?" she said, settling back into the porch swing. "Of course. I'm glad you didn't tell me what you were really doing 3 years ago." "Why?" "Because if I'd known you were building a real estate empire, I would have tried to help in ways that would have made everything worse." "How so?" "I would have pushed you to scale faster, to prioritize financial returns over community relationships, to operate like a conventional development company instead of the community-focused enterprise you actually built." She was probably right. The Jessica of 3 years ago would have applied traditional business school thinking to our unconventional approach, and traditional thinking would have compromised the community relationships that had made our success possible. "Plus," she added, "I needed to learn humility before I could be a useful partner. The promotion I was celebrating that night at Eddie's Steakhouse made me feel like I understood how business worked, but I didn't understand anything about building sustainable value. And you think you understand it now? I think I understand enough to know how much I still don't understand." Which is probably the most important thing I've learned. As the sun set behind the hills surrounding Riverside, casting long shadows across the historic district we'd spent 3 years renovating, I reflected on how dramatically our lives had changed since that morning when Jessica discovered the deed to our childhood home. The transformation had been about much more than real estate appreciation or business expansion. It had been about discovering that the most satisfying success comes from building something meaningful with people you care about. Jessica's journey from condescending corporate executive to humble community developer had been remarkable to witness, but my own evolution from secretive property investor to regional development leader had been equally significant. We'd both learned that sustainable success required the kind of long-term thinking that prioritized relationships over transactions, community benefit over individual achievement, and collaborative problem-solving over competitive advantage. The house where we'd grown up, the house Jessica had once seen as evidence of my failure to launch into adult independence, had become the foundation for launching something neither of us could have imagined when we were children, sharing dreams about what we'd accomplish when we grew up. The irony was perfect. The sister who'd called me pathetic for living at home had ultimately chosen to move back home herself. Not because she'd failed to build a successful life elsewhere, but because she'd discovered that the most meaningful success was building something valuable together. As we sat on the porch of the house that now served as headquarters for a multi-million-dollar development company, watching the lights come on in the historic district we'd helped transform, I realized that being underestimated had been the greatest gift Jessica could have given me. Her assumptions about my lack of ambition had provided the perfect cover for building something substantial without outside interference or premature pressure to scale. More importantly, her willingness to admit she'd been wrong and to learn from her mistakes had created the foundation for a partnership that had enhanced both our lives immeasurably. The sister who'd tried to rescue me from my supposedly pathetic existence had discovered that the most satisfying rescue was learning to build something meaningful together. Sometimes the best revenge against people who underestimate you isn't proving them wrong, it's helping them understand what they missed, and then building something better together. Jessica had been wrong about almost everything regarding my life, but she'd been willing to acknowledge her mistakes and transform them into opportunities for growth. That willingness to learn had made all the difference, not just for our business success, but for our relationship as sisters and partners in building something that would outlast both of us. The deed to the house might have my name on it, but the future we were building together belonged to both of us. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.